Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this screening of No Straight Lines. I am so excited to be joined by Vivian, who's the director of the film. Vivian, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm thrilled to be with you.
The feeling is very much mutual. I would love to hear, just to start off, I'd love to hear a little bit about your history and your interest with queer comics and what drove you to bring these five artists together and tell their stories.
Right. I was approached by Justin Hall, who is an expert in queer comics. He edited the first anthology of queer comics called No Straight Lines.
Mhm.
And he and another friend, Greg Strode, encouraged me to go to the world's first international gathering of queers in comics in 2015 in New York. So I went, not being an expert in comics whatsoever, and I was just completely astonished by what I saw. Walking into the main reception area, there was a person standing there with bright chartreuse colored hair, as out there and alternative as could be, talking with this older gentleman with balding head, wearing a button-down Ivy League collared shirt, looking as conventional as an old world as could be. The two of them were totally engaged. And then
Mhm.
there was a trans person and non-binary. It was the whole chaos jumble of who we are. And
Mhm.
they were all together and taking such delight in one
Mhm.
another. I was completely astonished. It shattered assumptions of
Mhm.
the stereotype of the artist as being
Mhm.
curmudgeonly and dour, wanting to be hiding away in the attic by themselves. The sense of ingathering of community is
Mhm.
what really drew me in as much as anything else. And then as a filmmaker, I'm always looking for good storytellers.
Mhm.
So we had these amazing people who had such a life force
Mhm.
of their own and who were doing really interesting work. And once I started to dive into the work and saw how, oh, this is a representation, this is basically the evolution
Mhm.
of how we were representing ourselves in this very amazing art form, I went, aha, this is my next project.
It's really something. And yeah, I think something that my team really responded to is what you brought up, how sort of wide the breadth of people you were able to include and voices and points of view. Can you speak a little bit to, once you got into this world, what the process was like, identifying, whose work you really wanted to go more deeply into?
Well, right. So one of the challenges of this particular film is that one, there was a plethora of images. So scaling down and making a selection,
Yeah.
narrowing the selection so it isn't an encyclopedia
Hmm.
or an anthology. And two, as a filmmaker, I'm really looking for really good storytellers and people who will reach. I like to have stories that will reach the viewer in the heart
Hmm.
first, and then try to get them to see the world slightly differently through their eyes and mind. Um, Narrowing it down to five main artists that we were profiling was actually quite challenging.
Hmm.
But with the help of Justin, we made that difficult selection, and it was very difficult to let go of some people, and so that we could have more detailed opportunity to get to know some of the people in a more intimate way. And then once I had a first assembly of the film, I looked at it, first rough cut, and it was the five pioneers of queer comics. And it felt kind of old. It felt
Hmm.
kind of stale. It felt kind of like, oh, these are really exciting people who led the charge for uh, presenting our lives, in comics, not just the superheroes, but the real actual experiences that we were
Hmm.
going through. And also they were chronicling the milestones of queer history in the US over 4 decades.
Yeah.
But still it felt like it was missing a vitality. And
Hmm.
so I did an experiment one day, and there was a follow-up conference a few years later in San Francisco. I set up my camera. I grabbed a dozen young artists one at a
Hmm.
time. I had literally 10 minutes each to say
Oh.
hello. I knew nothing about their work or who they were. Threw them in
Hmm.
front of the camera, started a conversation, and out came these most amazing comments and insights and thoughts. And once again, it was true that while just as the pioneers in queer comics were really compelling people and great
Mm.
storytellers doing wonderful stuff, so were the folks in the next generation, the next gen people,
Yeah.
and in between. And I didn't know how I was going to braid those two different elements together.
Yeah.
It was actually quite a challenge. It wasn't in terms of narrative structure. It was very difficult. I refer to them as my Greek chorus.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but eventually, through a lot of trial and error, I think you would agree that we found a place for them to feel integrated, synthesized with the other elements of the film.
Absolutely. And I think just like you mentioned, the effect is, yes, this longitudinal, incredibly, thorough chronology, but also you've got the horizontal and the vertical. I feel like you go really deeply into each of these folks, and it really jumps out. And I'm also curious from a technical perspective, what it was like for you to translate, 2D stories. You make so many wonderful, exciting artistic choices, and I'd love to hear more about how you developed that vision and then brought it to light.
You nailed it. Because while I was just bragging about having a plethora of images,
Yeah,
they were static.
yeah,
And so you can only do montages so much before it gets kind of redundant
yeah.
and not so fun and not so engaging. So I did try a few different techniques. One, I learned early on that it was impossible for people to listen to stories that were being
Mm.
told and read text in a comic book
Yeah.
or a comic page. And that became, so the pacing
Mm.
became a huge obstacle and one that I tried various techniques. I tried blurring some of the text to bring your eye to one section. I tried, eventually, let's just say the solution I found was to remove comics that were text heavy to
Mm.
whatever extent I could and replace them with images that were more visually driven and
Mm.
organized than text. So that was one technique. And the other was to focus on part of the comic frame
Mm.
and not try to give the whole thing. It's a tug of war between wanting to be true to the art and true to the experience of actually seeing the comic and reading it, and then trying to have an experience where the viewer is invited into the film
Mm.
and not sent away from the film and being feeling uncomfortable because you can't
Yeah.
keep up with reading. And then the third thing that we did was on a few of them, we did some animation of the comics, a little bit of motion
Mhm.
stuff happening. I tried to keep that to a minimum. I wanted to be respectful of the original work as being, as you said, two-dimensional. At the same time, hey, the film's being done now, so
Right.
let's use the tools of what we have now to accomplish the goal, which was to tell a compelling story, and not so much to tell. My goal wasn't to tell detailed history.
Mhm.
Uh, People who are looking for all the details will be disappointed.
Mhm.
My goal was to get folks to get them to be curious, and then you can go on the net and learn all that you want, and B, feel like they come to understand these experiences of these five main people
Mhm.
with a little more compassion for folks who are maybe not queer who are watching the film, and more understanding of, and also my goal really is to encourage young queer folks
Mhm.
to A, be comfortable with ourselves, and B, go out and celebrate who we are in our lives, and maybe C, go out and do something creative. And I just want to add one thing, which is that we all feel like we've arrived, that being queer, we
Mhm.
have all these laws protecting us. We have gay marriage. We have, Don't Ask, Don't Tell got, thrown out. But the statistics of attempt of suicide among gay youth by far outnumbers the general population. And I'm very aware of that statistic. And if
Mhm.
I'm trying to do anything with this film, it's to reach young queer people and give them some role models of folks who
Mhm.
faced obstacles and encountered them and found a way to reckon with them and be joyful and celebrate who we are.
Wow. That's obviously very important work, and we'll talk about Utah specifically in a second, but that certainly is a problem that's alive and well in our community, and so that's amazing to hear that that's part of your intention with this film. But speaking to your technique, I think you see exactly what you said. It's very layered, it's very rich. You're able to do so much, and I'm curious, what do you think it is about the comic book art form that sort of matched so well this way to document queer history, or to capture queer stories? What do you think it was about the medium itself that made this work possible, and made such a community around it?
Right, great question. Actually, one of the themes that I was very conscious of in the course of creating the film is, as Marx would say, the means of production. And in this case, the film chronicles access to creating comic books through it was a do-it-yourself DIY art form. All you needed was a pen, or even just a pencil and a piece of paper,
Mm.
and sit on the couch and go at it. You really didn't need a lot of training. You really didn't need much more than time and a pencil. you know,
Yeah.
as we move forward, in the decades and technology improves, then we start talking about things like offset presses and distribution through the whole network of queer bookstores and newspapers, and then we get into the shock and horror and joy of the internet itself,
Mm.
but the horror of it being, um, overtaken by the big box stores, Barnes and
Mm.
Noble and Amazon. So uh, I think that the notion of it being the short answer to your question is the notion of queer comics as being a do-it-yourself art form. I think really enabled a whole slew of folks to go out and create art.
Yeah, absolutely. It's door opening, both from that perspective, and also, like you were saying before, the way you present the film, I think opens the door for people to explore this history. And I know myself and a lot of my teammates bought No Straight Lines, the anthology, when we watched your film, and so absolutely, I think it's a door opening act across the board. And with the
Yeah.
last bit of time we have, I want to
But
talk a
let
little
me
bit
just say
about.
one more
Yeah,
thing. No, and the whole range of image making could be just some squiggly lines,
yeah,
some silly animal, kind of imaginary animal, to, if you're really good at it, rendering detail.
yeah. No, it's the breadth is impressive, and I also love that you pay credence to that in the film. That there is very wide range of styles as well. It feels like longitudinal. I keep bringing up because it's I enjoyed the balance there. And with our last little bit of time, I do want to talk a little bit about your previous work in general, because I think your short Last Day of Freedom sort of speaks to the same ideas about addressing some of these larger sort of social issues. And also your film that has a local Utah connection. I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about both of those things, how you see them sort of leading up to or in conversation with No Straight Lines, and then of course from the Utah perspective, what it means to sort of return with a feature, and what that means to you today.
Right, complicated question, and
Yeah.
I will try to synthesize
Good.
an answer. Um, my joy in being here with you and talking to an audience of queer film viewers in Utah is very personal. In that some years back, I was commissioned to do a short documentary called "Families Are Forever." It was commissioned by the Family Acceptance Project, and they had been working very closely with the Mormon Church and many other communities of faith to
Mm.
try to encourage parents of gay teenagers who are struggling in the tug of war between loyalty to their kids and their family and
Mm.
loyalty to their church or synagogue or whatever temple. Um, and it was a very poignant opportunity for me to
Mm.
get to know Mormon community better. And the film went wide and far, and I hope it helped impact a lot of families. I know it did.
Mm.
Um, and from that project, that's when I actually started to become aware of the statistics on teen suicide.
Yeah.
And I was very grateful that that particular film was selected by, I forget the name of the organization, but there's a national organization for suicide prevention that's selected No Straight Lines as the first project for queer community in particular, but made by a queer organization that was given the seal of approval by that organization. Um, but I want to go back even further in time in terms of influences. My film partner of many years was a very controversial fellow named Marlon Riggs. Did a
Mm.
piece called Tongues Untied about being a Black gay man in America.
Mhm.
When it was broadcast on national PBS in 1991, it created a big stir. The culture wars were at their height, and
Mm.
people like Jesse Helms and Pat Robertson were very vocal in trying to oppose the broadcast of the film. And really, it was a film that was made for a very specific audience of Black gay men.
Mm.
And it was not trying to reach an outside audience. And anything that was felt to be explaining who African American gay men are was taken out.
Mm.
And anything that was a conversation among Black gay men was included.
Mm.
And from that process of being close with Marlon, and I was the additional cinematographer on the piece, and he and I were best friends and collaborators. I took that lesson and applied it to No Straight Lines.
Mm.
And I was not interested in explaining and expository. As I said earlier, I can leave the internet. The internet is there for folks who want to get more information.
Yeah.
I wanted to keep it within the family, as it were, and yet also yet also knowing that if you do something designed for a very particular audience, it infuses it with an authenticity and a heft and a vitality that otherwise would be leached from the piece. So I hope that that mission has been accomplished, and I think that the shock of the film being embraced by the premier film festival outside of, I should say, along with Sundance's Tribeca in the U.S. To have them embrace the film is a testament to the strength of that way of that approach to filmmaking and storytelling in general.
Absolutely. I see these each as community building acts of work, and we're just so glad you're part of our community, and we couldn't thank you enough for being with us today, but also for sharing your film with us. I think for all the reasons you mentioned, it's so important to play this sort of work in our community, and we're just glad you're a part of it.
Well, thank you for what you're doing, because you know what? If we didn't have curators and programmers and venues, ideally in person, but you know, it's great we have technology to bring us together through electronics. But without your programming and your kind of like giving a selection of and a frame for these works, it would be lost in the noise of the internet.
Well, we're so glad to have you. Thanks again, Vivian, and thanks to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you.